The classroom was buzzing with the usual middle school energy. Some students were exchanging whispers, others doodling on their notebooks, while a few stared absently out the window. It was the sort of scene that happened every day, a casual beginning to the long school day. The bright fluorescent lights flickered above the rows of desks, casting a sterile glow on the students' faces. Posters about respect and teamwork hung crookedly on the walls, barely noticed by the kids who had become so accustomed to their school environment. In the back corner, a clock ticked relentlessly, the only thing in the room that seemed to keep time with any real precision. At the front of the room stood Miss Thompson, a woman in her mid-30s with glasses that always seemed to slide down the bridge of her nose. She had a no-nonsense air about her, commanding attention as soon as she entered the room. Though her sharp eyes missed nothing, her sarcastic smile often made students feel like they were under her microscope. Miss Thompson didn't believe in coddling her students. If you made a mistake, you'd hear about it. If you looked different, you'd probably be mocked in some subtle way. Today, she stood at the front of the room, reviewing the upcoming quiz on history, her voice cutting through the murmur of the class. "All right, let's try to focus, people. It's not rocket science, just a little bit of history," she said with a half-smirk, scanning the room. The students grew quiet, though it wasn't from respect. It was more out of habit. They knew what would happen if they didn't. Some would be ridiculed, others ignored. Then there was Zara, a smart and confident black girl, sitting near the front of the class. Zara was a quiet presence, often keeping to herself, though it was clear that she was far from timid. She wasn't the type to let things slide if they crossed a line. Her dark curls framed her face, and her gaze was calm yet assertive, a perfect reflection of the person she was. Zara often preferred listening to speaking, but when she had something to say, she said it, firmly, without hesitation. Zara wasn't unaware of the dynamics in the classroom. She had felt Miss Thompson's judgment before, especially when Miss Thompson singled her out for things that seemed trivial compared to how other students were treated. Zara often found herself the target of subtle, sarcastic comments, usually veiled in the form of a question or a casual remark, but everyone in the class could hear it for what it was. "Zara, did you read the chapter, or were you too busy with your—" Miss Thompson's voice trailed off as she glanced at Zara with a raised eyebrow, letting the sentence hang in the air. "I mean, I'm sure your hair is more important than a little history quiz, right?" The class stifled chuckles, and Zara's face remained calm, though her fingers tightened around the edge of her notebook. She had heard these remarks before, and while she wasn't one to make a scene, it didn't mean they didn't sting. Some of her classmates exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one said anything. A few students like Maya, who sat next to Zara, exchanged looks of empathy, but they remained quiet. Maya knew that speaking up could make things worse, not just for Zara, but for anyone who tried to defend her. The truth was, Miss Thompson wasn't just a teacher, she was a force. If you crossed her, the rest of the year could feel like a battle. Zara exhaled quietly, choosing to ignore the barb. It wasn't worth engaging. She could hold her own, and she had learned long ago that her worth wasn't determined by snide comments or sideways glances. But today, something in her felt different. Maybe it was the tension building in the classroom, or the small, sharp sting of yet another comment, but it felt like something was about to change. As the class settled down, and Miss Thompson moved on to the quiz review, the atmosphere shifted. Zara couldn't help but wonder if Miss Thompson even realized how her words affected the students who weren't part of the in-crowd. Or maybe, Zara thought, Miss Thompson simply didn't care. But one thing was certain. Today wasn't going to go like any other day. Something was brewing under the surface, and Zara could feel it. The tension between Zara and Miss Thompson had been building over time, like the quiet hum of a storm on the horizon, just waiting for the right moment to break. Every day, Miss Thompson's subtle remarks grew sharper, more frequent, as though she were testing the limits of Zara's patience. Zara was no stranger to teasing. In fact, she had developed a thick skin over the years, learning to take criticism without reacting. But today, it felt different. It was the day of the class debate, and Ms. Thompson had assigned students to discuss the pros and cons of historical events. Zara, always prepared, had already gathered her notes and was ready to speak. But as soon as Ms. Thompson handed her the floor, she noticed the teacher's usual gleam of sarcasm in her eyes. "All right, Zara, let's see what you have to say. But I'd advise you to try not to mess this up, okay?" Ms. Thompson's voice was cool, and the way she looked at Zara made it feel like the words were laced with something more than just casual indifference. Zara took a deep breath, standing to address the class. She wasn't bothered by the comment. Instead, she focused on the topic at hand, speaking clearly and confidently about the historical significance of the debate topic. Her arguments were solid, well-reasoned, and articulated with precision. Zara knew her material. She was proud of the work she had put into preparing. But Miss Thompson wasn't interested in the content. She was interested in making Zara feel small. Well, that's one way to look at it. But I think it's a bit too idealistic, don't you think? Ms. Thompson interrupted with a mockingly thoughtful expression. "You should aim for something a little more grounded. Maybe try a little harder next time, Zara. It's not like you're the only one struggling in this class." Zara kept her composure. She smiled politely, nodding her head. Her voice remained steady, though her hands had begun to clench at her sides. She had heard this before. The snide comments, the dismissive remarks disguised as advice. But Zara knew the game. She wasn't going to let Miss Thompson get under her skin. "I understand your point, Miss Thompson, but I believe the facts speak for themselves," Zara responded, her tone calm but firm. The room fell silent for a moment, students shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They knew the tension that existed between Zara and Miss Thompson, and many of them, including Maya, could see how Miss Thompson's words were meant to undermine Zara in front of the class. Miss Thompson smirked, a dangerous glint in her eyes. "Oh, I'm sure you do, Zara. After all, you're lucky to be sitting up here today, right? I mean, I've seen students fail before. But hey, you're still managing to hold it together. That's something to be proud of, I suppose." Some of the classmates glanced at each other, unease spreading like wildfire through the room. James, sitting at the back of the class, exchanged a quick glance with Maya. He could see how Zara was handling the situation with remarkable poise, but even he couldn't ignore how unfair it was. He didn't know Zara well, but no one deserved to be treated that way, especially not by a teacher. Yet, despite his thoughts, James kept quiet. Carla, who sat next to him, rolled her eyes but didn't speak up either. It was always the same. Whenever Ms. Thompson made one of her pointed remarks, no one ever said anything. It was as if they were all waiting for someone else to do the right thing. Fear held them all back, an invisible chain of uncertainty. As Zara continued to speak, her confidence unwavering, Miss Thompson's sarcasm only grew sharper. The more Zara spoke, the more Miss Thompson seemed determined to tear her down. "Well, I'm sure that's what the textbooks say, but you've got to look at the real world, Zara. Maybe that's where you're missing the mark. You can't just copy and paste what you read in a book and expect it to make sense in real life." Her voice was dripping with mockery now. "Don't worry, though. I'm sure you'll figure it out one day. Maybe next time, you'll surprise us." Zara's eyes flickered for a moment. She could feel the weight of the teacher's words bearing down on her. They weren't just criticisms of her debate. They were criticisms of her, of who she was. It wasn't about the lesson. It was about something deeper, something unspoken. But Zara didn't rise to the bait. Instead, she finished her points, gave a polite nod, and returned to her seat, her heart pounding, but her face betraying nothing. Ms. Thompson stood at the front, her eyes scanning the room, searching for any signs of rebellion, any student brave enough to challenge her. She found none. The class remained still, the weight of the unspoken tension hanging in the air. The rest of the students were uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. Maya, who was always quick to defend others, felt her stomach twist with guilt. She wanted to say something, to stand up for Zara, but she was too afraid. Everyone knew how Miss Thompson, could be when she was crossed. As the class continued, Zara felt herself withdrawing, retreating into the quiet corners of her mind. It wasn't just the words that hurt. It was the way they made her feel invisible, like she didn't matter, like her voice didn't count. The tension between Miss Thompson and Zara was no longer just a quiet undercurrent. It was growing, building to something bigger, something that could no longer be ignored. And though Zara didn't know it yet, that moment was going to be the tipping point. It was an ordinary Tuesday morning when the unexpected happened. The usual hum of the classroom was punctuated by the clatter of the door opening, and all heads turned. Mr. Carter, the principal, stood in the doorway. His presence was anything but ordinary. Tall, with a commanding but kind demeanor, he was well known throughout the school for his approachability, fairness, and firm belief in the importance of respect. His visits to classrooms were rare but not unheard of, usually to observe a lesson or meet with teachers. But today, something about his appearance felt different. There was an air of anticipation, as if the day had been carefully set up for something pivotal to unfold. Zara, who had been seated at her desk in the front row, barely noticed the principal's arrival at first. She was used to the occasional interruption, her mind more focused on the task at hand. Today's lesson about the civil rights movement. Ms. Thompson, however, was quick to notice. She didn't even look up when Mr. Carter entered. Instead, her eyes zeroed in on Zara. "All right, Zara," she said, her tone carrying that all-too-familiar sarcasm. "You're always so quick to answer. Let's see if you can impress us today. Tell us, what was the primary goal of the Civil Rights Act of 1964? Zara, who had been silently preparing herself for the question, stood up to respond. She always took pride in her knowledge of history, and her voice was steady as she answered. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was designed to end segregation in public places, ban employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and provide equal access to education and public services. Her answer was clear, precise, and correct. It was exactly what Miss Thompson had wanted. But instead of acknowledging the strength of her answer, Miss Thompson's lips curled into a faint, mocking smile. "Ah, yes, very textbook, Zara. But tell me, how many of those ideals have actually been fully implemented?" Miss Thompson raised her eyebrows dramatically. "You seem to think that equality can be solved by a law. Maybe you're not living in the real world, after all." The class shifted uncomfortably. Maya cast a quick, apologetic glance at Zara, but once again, no one dared speak up. Miss Thompson had a way of making her sarcasm seem like a teaching tool, and no one wanted to risk drawing her attention. But just as Zara's hands gripped the edges of her desk, preparing for the usual response she gave to these kinds of comments, a calm, measured one, Mr. Carter stepped forward. His deep voice cut through the tension. "Actually, Miss Thompson," he said, his tone sharp but measured, "you might want to hold off on that kind of commentary for a second." The class froze. Zara's heart skipped a beat, and she turned to face the principal. Miss Thompson, who had been looking over her notes with a smug expression, snapped her gaze to Mr. Carter. "Is there something I can help you with, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice a mix of surprise and slight defensiveness. Mr. Carter's eyes moved from Miss Thompson to Zara. He took a breath, and the classroom went silent, the tension hanging thick in the air. "Yes, Miss Thompson," he said, his voice clear and commanding. "There is something you should know." "Zara," he paused, and then continued with a quiet emphasis. "Zara is my daughter." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The words hung in the air, their weight settling over the room like a blanket. Zara's heart skipped a beat, and her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected this, not in a million years. The class sat in stunned silence, their eyes flickering from Zara to Mr. Carter and back again. Miss Thompson's face shifted from smug confidence to visible shock, the color draining from her cheeks. Her mouth opened and closed as if trying to form words, but none came out. Zara, ever the picture of composure, sat still at her desk, her expression unchanged. She wasn't surprised. She had known Mr. Carter was her father, after all, but the way everything unfolded made her heart race. She had never wanted her connection to the principal to be the focal point of anyone's attention. But now, it was undeniable, and she knew that this moment would change everything. I didn't know, Miss Thompson stammered, her voice dropping several octaves. She turned her gaze toward Zara, searching her face for some sign of reaction. But Zara gave nothing away. The class was still silent, their eyes wide with disbelief. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically in an instant. Zara, the quiet student who had always kept her head down, was no longer just another name in the roll book. She was the principal's daughter, the child of the man who was the very embodiment of authority in the school. Mr. Carter's voice was steady, but there was a firm edge to it now. Ms. Thompson, I believe you owe my daughter an apology. No student should be made to feel as though they are less than their peers, no matter who they are or where they come from. He turned to the class, his gaze sweeping over the room. And all of you should remember that respect is the foundation of any learning environment. We treat each other with kindness, regardless of background, status, or appearance. Zara's heart swelled with something she couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe? Or gratitude. Perhaps a little bit of both. She had never expected this from her father, especially not in a classroom full of her peers. But in that moment, she felt seen, understood in a way she hadn't realized she needed. Ms. Thompson's posture shifted as Mr. Carter spoke, and she finally seemed to realize the full scope of her mistake. Her usual air of arrogance seemed to crumble before their eyes, replaced with a nervous, almost defeated demeanor. I'm sorry, Zara, she muttered, her voice small. I didn't realize that I should have been more thoughtful. But it was clear from the tone of her voice, the forced apology, that it wasn't enough. It wasn't just about saying the words. It was about understanding the harm that had been done. Zara nodded, her voice soft but firm. It's okay, Ms. Thompson, but next time, maybe think before you speak. The class seemed to breathe collectively, and a sense of unease lingered in the air. But as Mr. Carter turned to leave, he shot a final glance back at the students. Respect people, he said, his voice full of finality. It costs nothing, but it means everything. As Mr. Carter exited the room, the silence remained for a moment longer before the usual chatter began to bubble up again. But this time, things felt different. Zara's classmates exchanged glances, some of them visibly uncomfortable, others looking at Zara with newfound respect. And Zara? She sat quietly, her gaze steady, the same calm confidence she had always carried within her now more evident than ever. After the surprising turn of events in the classroom, the day continued in an air of awkwardness and quiet reflection. The final bell rang, signaling the end of the lesson, and the students began filing out of the room. But as Zara gathered her things and stood to leave, she noticed that Miss Thompson was still at the front of the classroom, her posture slumped, her usual sharp gaze now softened with something else, regret. The classroom emptied, and Zara lingered for a moment, her bag slung over one shoulder, her thoughts swirling. She had never imagined that such a moment, her father revealing their connection, would change so much in an instant. She had walked into the room that morning with the same sense of calm she always carried, and now she felt different. She felt stronger. But before she could leave, Miss Thompson approached her, her voice hesitant but genuine. "Zara, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked quietly, her usual authority replaced with a more vulnerable tone. Zara stopped and turned to face her teacher. She could see the weight of the situation in Miss Thompson's eyes, and she knew what was coming. Zara didn't need to say anything right away. She simply nodded, waiting. Miss Thompson hesitated, wringing her hands nervously, as though unsure of how to begin. She took a deep breath and finally spoke, her voice low. "I want to apologize, Zara," she said, her words carrying a sincerity Zara hadn't expected. "What I said today, it was wrong. I can't believe I let my own biases cloud my judgment, especially toward you. I've seen the way you work, how you think, and I know now that I've treated you unfairly, and I deeply regret that." Zara listened, her expression neutral. She could feel the weight of Miss Thompson's apology, but she also knew that words alone weren't enough. Still, she appreciated the effort. "I accept your apology, Miss Thompson," Zara said calmly, her voice steady but firm. "But I want you to know something. Respect is not a choice. It's not negotiable. No one should have to earn it based on their background, appearance, or anything else. It's something everyone deserves, and I'm not okay with being treated any less than that, no matter who I am." Miss Thompson nodded, her face showing the weight of Zara's words. She had never seen this side of Zara before, this quiet strength, this wisdom beyond her years. She felt a deep sense of shame for having treated a student this way, and for a moment she simply stood there, taking it all in. "I'll do better, Zara," Miss Thompson promised, her voice quiet but resolute. "I won't forget this lesson. I can't." Zara smiled faintly, her tone softening. "I hope not. But we all make mistakes. It's how we learn from them that matters." With that, Zara turned to leave, her footsteps light but purposeful. She was proud of herself, not just for standing her ground, but for handling the situation with maturity and dignity. She had grown in that moment, and it felt like the world had shifted a little bit for the better. Later that day, Mr. Carter, the principal, addressed the entire school in the morning announcements. His voice carried over the PA system, calm and clear, as students shuffled through the halls, getting ready for their next classes. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Carter began, his tone warm but firm. "Today, I want to take a moment to remind you all of something very important, something that we too often forget. It's easy to judge someone based on the way they look, the way they speak, or where they come from. But I need you to understand this. None of that defines who a person truly is. What matters is who they are on the inside, how they treat others, and what they stand for." There was a pause as students stopped, listening intently. Some may have heard these words before, but the way Mr. Carter spoke made them feel different, more meaningful. "I'm sure most of you witnessed an event in Mrs. Thompson's class today," Mr. Carter continued. "I want you to know that we are all responsible for the way we treat others. We all have a part to play in creating a positive and inclusive environment. There is no room for mockery, discrimination, or disrespect here. We need to build each other up, not tear each other down." He let his words sink in for a moment before adding, "Zara, who is a student in our school and also my daughter, handled herself with remarkable dignity today. And she's a reminder that we all deserve respect, no matter where we come from or what we look like. Treat others with kindness, empathy, and understanding. That's the kind of school we want to be." The school was silent after Mr. Carter's message, the weight of his words settling into the hearts of the students. The following weeks passed by, and while life at school returned to its routine, something had undeniably changed. Zara's confidence had grown, not just because of the incident with Miss Thompson, but because of how she had navigated the experience. She had stood up for herself, remained calm and dignified in the face of unfair treatment, and now she carried herself with a new sense of strength. She knew that people would judge her based on the color of her skin, the way she spoke, or even her connection to the principal. But Zara understood now, more than ever, that those judgments didn't define her. Her worth was not dependent on what others thought of her. She was not just a student in a classroom. She was a person with her own values, her own voice, and her own path to follow. And in that knowledge, Zara found a new sense of empowerment. As she walked through the hallways, her head held high, Zara knew she had faced a pivotal moment in her life. The ridicule, the mockery, the tension, all of it had shaped her, but it didn't break her. She was more than capable of handling whatever came next. And in the quiet strength she carried with her, she knew she was ready to make a difference. Not just for herself, but for others who had been silenced or overlooked. Her journey wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving, about defining her own worth and refusing to let anyone take that from her. Zara had found her voice, and nothing could take that away. In the weeks that followed the incident, Ms. Thompson took time to reflect on the way she had treated Zara and others. Her apology had been a starting point, but she knew that real change required more than just words. She began seeking advice from colleagues on how to be more mindful of her behavior in the classroom. She looked for training and attended workshops on cultural sensitivity, bias awareness, and inclusive teaching practices. Ms. Thompson's transformation was gradual but noticeable. She became more thoughtful in her interactions with students, deliberately offering encouragement and praise to those who might have once been overlooked or dismissed. Her sarcasm, which had once been a hallmark of her teaching style, was replaced with genuine engagement. She started acknowledging the unique perspectives and strengths that each student brought to the table. As the weeks passed, Ms. Thompson's classroom began to feel different. The atmosphere shifted from one of tension and competition to one of collaboration and mutual respect. Her students, including Zara, noticed the difference. Zara had always been a strong student, but now she felt truly valued, not just for her academic achievements, but for her character and individuality. Though Zara had never asked for recognition, it became clear that her quiet strength and dignity had made a lasting impact. Her peers began to see her in a new light, not just as the principal's daughter, but as someone who could handle adversity with grace. Students who once stayed quiet when others were mocked began to speak up, inspired by Zara's calm resolve in the face of disrespect. In group discussions, Zara's voice became one that others listened to, not because of her father's position, but because of the wisdom she carried. She didn't push herself into the spotlight, but when she spoke, her words were thoughtful and measured. She became a quiet leader in the classroom, someone who others looked up to, not for any external reason, but because of the way she carried herself. Zara's leadership wasn't loud or flashy. It was simply about being true to herself, about standing firm in her values of respect and kindness. Her classmates admired her not only for how she handled her own challenges, but for the way she encouraged others to do the same. Zara had become a role model, not because she tried to lead, but because she had remained steadfast in her integrity. The transformation of both Zara and Ms. Thompson reflected the true power of empathy, growth, and reflection. Zara's experience was a reminder that respect must be earned by treating others with dignity, regardless of their background or circumstances. Ms. Thompson's ability to recognize her mistakes and make efforts to improve was a testament to the importance of being willing to learn and grow as a teacher and as a person. As for Zara, she learned that the strength to overcome adversity doesn't come from fighting back in anger, but from standing firm in one's beliefs and staying true to who you are. She had faced the sting of mockery, but had emerged with even more self-assurance, understanding that her worth would never be dictated by someone else's judgment. The story ended with a sense of growth, not just for Zara and Ms. Thompson, but for the entire school community. The lesson was clear. We must treat others with kindness and respect, not because they are like us, but because they deserve it, simply because they are human. And as Zara walked out of the classroom that day, her head held high and her heart full of purpose, she knew that this was only the beginning. Her journey was one of continual growth, and the lessons learned from this experience would guide her for years to come. The world needed more people who understood that true leadership wasn't about power or status. It was about compassion, integrity, and the ability to inspire others to be the best versions of themselves. Zara was well on her way to becoming that kind of person,